So think about being unique for a moment. What does it mean to be unique? You know, if say 10% of the population displays a unique trait, we kind of take notice because 90% is one way and 10% is the other way. And so if 10% of the population is incredibly smart, you know, businesses will go after the top 10% of a class, a graduating class. My wife is a recruiter for attorneys, and law firms oftentimes will ask for someone who is from the top 10% of the law school class because they figure that they're united by some common traits, maybe hard work or a certain level of IQ or a certain level of ability to manage details all at once. And so they go after that unique kind of 10%. How many people here are gluten or lactose intolerant, if you're willing to admit that at least? So, you know, a handful of us, you know, they've kind of more and more people are recognizing some of those intolerances. And, you know, it's a large enough of a subgroup. I don't know if it's quite 10% of the population, but it's enough people. So they're saying, what's behind that? And they're starting to study it more and more to figure out the causes because it's kind of a unique subgroup. You know, if 10% of the population likes Barry Manilow music, for example, people are going to try to figure out what's going on. Sorry to hurt you. You're in a minority, Mike. Try to figure out what's going on. What unites that unique, artistically creative subgroup of people? In Luke 17, 90% of the people in the story go one direction. And then 1% of the people in the story go a totally opposite direction, or 10% I should say. And so we're going to look at the story and we're going to ask the question, what unites that 10%? What gives? What's behind it? What caused that 10% to act so differently than the rest of the crowd? And how can we, if it's a good thing, get a little bit of that in our lives as well? So Luke 17 is the story we're going to dive into today. And we're going to start at verse 11. It's the story of the 10 lepers, not leopards with spots. This is even worse than having spots. This would be any kind of skin disease that would be recognized in ancient times where you'd have some kind of just terrible rash, or it would be actual limbs kind of wearing off. Leprosy back then could even be mold in your house. They would kind of see the house as leprous. And so they didn't quite have the medical definition that we do today. It covered a whole host of kind of skin-based diseases. And if you were recognized as having leprosy, it was a big problem. They would take you from your home. If the priest would diagnose it as leprosy, because the priests were kind of all things, politicians and doctors and priests all in one, and if they diagnosed you and confirmed leprosy, it meant that you were kind of, in a sense, being punished by God. Have you ever felt that way? If something bad happens to you, it's God being mean to you? Well, they really believed that about leprosy, and you were being cursed, and it was time to leave. Otherwise, you'd infect others, and so they would pull you from your home, and they would even remove you from the city, and you'd have to live with the only other people who would live with you, a leper colony. And so they'd be these migrating bands of lepers running around the countryside begging from a distance that people would drop some money or some food and get out of their way. Leprosy was, in many ways, a death sentence, except you'd still be alive. It'd be a living death sentence. It was an absolute nightmare. And that's where these 10 are living. So verse 11 of Luke 17. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go. Show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. This is a marvelous moment here. So Jesus could have done, what could he have done? He could have pulled his magic hat off and done a little hocus pocus and pulled out some free skin or a little magic Tinkerbell dust and just thrown it on them, and poof, and they have this healing. But I love how he says, "Go." And they had this moment where they had to decide, well, we kind of came here for healing, bro, and last I checked, my fingers were still falling off, so could you kind of do the healing thing, and then I'll go show myself to the priest? Because showing yourself to the priest was the moment in which you would be diagnosed as clean again, and it took that priest's official say-so for you to get back in the game, to be admitted back to the city and back into your family. So we're going to go to the priests. We're not healed yet. And I think this demonstrates the principle of active versus passive waiting. Have you ever had that moment where you said, God, I really want to know your will about whether you want me to do this or that, and I'm just going to kind of hang out and wait for you to tell me what to do. And then days pass, weeks pass, months pass. Sometimes I'll talk to people. I'm like, hey, I really feel like God has gifted you. Would you like to serve in our ministry team somewhere just to see exactly how he's gifted you? And sometimes I'll get a person will say, I'll pray about that. And they'll kind of say, well, as soon as God tells me to, somehow there's going to be a sign in the stars, there's going to be writing in the sand, I'll have a dream or whatever. And those things are all good and possible. But Jesus here favors active waiting. He favors saying, I'm not going to just sit back and say, God, you go ahead and dance, and when I figure it out your puzzle, I'll move forward with my life. He says, go and show yourselves to the priests. Even though you don't see yourself as healed yet, I want you on faith, believing that my word is so strong that I will heal you on the way. And so they have to choose to leave him behind and actually walk away from the guy that they know can heal them and go to the guy that maybe they only have one chance to meet with and say, I'm healed with. And if they show up and they're not healed, this could be it. This could be their last chance. And so it took an act of faith to actively wait for healing, to walk away, to go to the priests and trust that by the time they get there, fingers are back, man. Skin looks good. It took an act of faith, active waiting. I always challenge people to do active versus passive waiting. Don't wait for God to do everything. Start moving forward. If you are going in the wrong direction, he will show you and he'll direct you in another direction. It's easy to move. You've heard the expression, a moving ship than a ship that isn't moving. Try active waiting in that life decision. Dip your foot in the pond of maybe he wants me to do this. I'm going to try it. I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to take an internship. I'm going to go on a first date with that person just to see maybe if that's the person he might be calling me to marry. If maybe I'm going to try sitting down with someone who does that career so that I can learn about it rather than just wait for God to tell me if he wants me to be that career or not. Active waiting demonstrates trust that God will direct you as you go, rather than sitting back passively saying, God, you work it out, and then drag me along. The other thing we see there is that, verse 17, let's pick up here. One of them, now this is 10%, like the figure I gave you, 1 out of 10, 10%, right? 10%. When he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. So 90% go one way, 10%, 1 out of 10, one unique individual does something different.
Yeah,
he does something very different.
This is awesome. I gotta say thanks. Jesus, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank God! I'm healed! Oh, thank you.
Now get out of here. Everybody gets it. Everybody, Josh can both rap and act. How about that? Forget Bo Jackson and Cordell Stewart. He can sing, he can rap, and he can act. That was impressive. This 1% did exactly the opposite of everyone else. They all took the step of faith together. The whole leper small group. That's an interesting small group idea. The whole leper small group went in one direction. One of them stops, and the other's trotting along. Hey, dude, we're better. Let's go. Let's go to the priest. Let's move on. Jesus is like, I get it. The priest is the next step. I need to get back to my family and get back in the city. But the guy who healed me is back there. And I don't want to leave him. I don't want to take what he's given me and move on with my life. I don't want to accept the gift and leave the giver. I don't want to walk away from this, God. Even if it means I have to put off what I've been looking forward for years. I need to go back. He was uncontrolled, as you saw with Josh's acting job. He went back to Jesus and falls at his feet and thanks him and praises him. And he holds on to Jesus with fingers that he probably couldn't even use before that moment. And he looked up at Jesus with a face that he would have kept cloaked and hidden up to that moment. And before he went to the priest, before he went back to his life, before he went back to do anything else, he wanted to look this man eyeball to eyeball, to touch this man with his new skin and look into him and say, thank you. Nothing else mattered more than that to him. Nothing else mattered more to this one man, this 10%. Two lessons come from this. Two lessons come from watching this man who would rather adore than abandon Jesus. Number one, God gives us stuff to enhance rather than sever our relationship with him. This is a big one. If you're taking notes, this is kind of in the middle of the page on the back side of the bulletin you got on your way in. God does not give you and I stuff to kind of send us into the sunset. Hey, great family, great home, great car, great job, great life, great health, great body, whatever you have that you're thankful for or maybe even take for granted and don't even feel thankful for. He doesn't give us those things to kind of pat us on the head and say, now have at it. He gives us those things so that we would turn to him as the giver and live a gratitude-based life with him at the center. God doesn't give us things to sever, but rather to enhance that relationship. And so everything he gives us, he doesn't need us to be groveling 100% of the time, but he just wants us to operate out of this abundance that he's created and not kind of divorce him from the picture. Secondly, look what happens next. Let's flip back to that slide and of the verse 17. Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, buckle up, listen to this. Then he said to him, rise and go, your faith has made you well. Could it be that Jesus is saying through this story, you are not well until you're well with me? You could have stuff, you can have health, you could have wealth. It is not an indicator about whether everything's okay. You could feel amazing. You could take one of those shakes that you get in the morning that makes you feel like $1,000,000, like you could run through a brick wall. One of these, my wife and I had this, it was a Puritan's Pride shake. It was like an orange thing. I felt like I could run a train off the tracks after one of these shakes. Have you ever had one of those miracle shakes? Jesus is like, I'm glad you feel great, but you're only well when you're well with me, when you are holding to the giver rather than clutching and hoarding the gift. So easily we pull the two apart and live in isolation with what he's given to the point where we almost feel as though we've given them to ourselves and earned them ourselves, rather than, wait a minute, I'm not going forward until I go backward, until I grab a hold of the giver, grab his hand, his ankle, his foot, and look up and just praise him. I want to teach myself that he's the source, and I'm not well. No matter how well my life is going, I'm not well until he is at the center. Because the next time something happens, I'll have another problem, and who am I going to go to if he's not in my life? I went to McDonald's once with my kids, and it was sometimes can be a little crazy there, especially at the one in town with the playground, you know. So you have to kind of buckle your safety harness on your way in the door, especially during the high kid traffic hours. And one time, we were in there with a group of kids, and one of them, a 6-year-old, stripped naked and ran around McDonald's naked. And his parents are freaking out, and then he climbs up in the no one over like 7 kind of play thing, and his dad is mortified trying to squeeze up the little ladders and through the little holes to catch his naked son and then drag him through out. And you wonder, like, there's 45 kids here. What got into that one? And that's kind of the sense you have with this story. There's 10 lepers. Jesus is like, there's 10 of them. Why is only one? What got into this one? That he is at my feet crying and sobbing like a little baby when the other ones kind of just moved on with things. And he gives us a huge clue on the why. Notice the clue he gives us. He says, except this, say that next word with me, foreigner. Foreigner we know from Samaria, Samaritan foreigner. That was the nation they were kind of next to, and Jews hated Samaritans for a long historical story that I won't try to get to the bottom of right now, other than they just saw them as kind of traitors to the faith. Horrible people, and they would actually, instead of going through Samaria when they wanted to go from one end to the other of Jerusalem, because it kind of looped around it, they would walk all the way around Samaria because they didn't want to put their feet on the dirty dust of that region. This man was the only one, it looks like, of the 10 that was a foreigner. The rest of them were Jews. Nothing against Jews at all, but they were Jews, and so they also had a sense of themselves as more than lepers. They had a sense of themselves as God's chosen people, which is a good thing, but the problem was they felt that they deserved better than leprosy. They felt that God's chosenness drove them to kind of a life that they were missing out on because the leprosy was holding them back, and so they were waiting to kind of get back on par. They were God's chosen people. They weren't supposed to be a part of a leper colony. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, and so they wanted to get back on to where they deserved to be. But the foreigner, see, Samaritans knew that Jews wouldn't even talk to them. And so when this Jew talks to him and actually brings a promise of healing to him, he doesn't feel like he deserves it. He doesn't see his disease as something that he doesn't deserve. He doesn't look at it through that framework. Because when we look at what we have through the lens of I deserve it or I don't, we usually come out ahead of where we should be. And we misunderstand the context of our lives. And we don't handle it well. If you have cancer and you think, do I deserve this or not? You're asking a question that's probably going to lead you to misery. Because you're going to get back to the question, does God even love me or not? Because I'm the only one that I see with cancer. I'm the only one I know that's going through divorce. I'm the only one I know that's going through family problems, relationship breakdown, that's been laid off, that's this lonely. I don't deserve that. The foreigner doesn't feel like he deserves better. And so when he gets better, he cannot move on and take it for granted. He has to turn back and go back to the source. And he's just too full of gratitude to do anything else. That's the clue. Foreigner is a clue of what got into him. But we're going to rewind to make sure. Okay, we're going to look at, oftentimes when you read the Bible, the story before the story or the story after the story kind of lights the story itself on fire. The context is king, if you've heard the expression. And so we're going to rewind to hear the story before this, the prelude to this story, and see how it brings the truth to light about what gets into this one guy, this 10%. The story before it, Jesus first says to his disciples, forgive people no matter how many times they sin against you. The disciples' next response is, increase our faith then. Because they're like, I can forgive Peter for punching me twice, but 3 times? You got to be kidding me. So Jesus, your desire for us to be forgiving people, we're going to need more faith. We're going to need a stronger relationship with you. We're going to build depth. We need more connection to you to be able to have the power to do that. And Jesus is like, well, you asked for it. I'll give you what you're asking for. And then he tells this next story, which happens before the 10 lepers. Look at verse 7. Suppose one of you has a servant plowing or looking after the sheep. So think of, put it in our context, you're a boss, you have an employee. You're a coach, you have a player. You're a teacher, you have a student. An authority and a servant of some kind, okay? Will he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, come along now and sit down to eat? Won't he rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready, and wait on me while I eat and drink? After that, you may eat and drink. In other words, does your boss or your coach or your teacher owe you something other than your salary or whatever for doing your job? When you go to work, 8 to 5, and go home, does your boss owe you something extra? Is he indebted to you? Does your coach owe you a favor because you played hard? Do you deserve more than your salary? Verse 9. Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Now, it sounds a little harsh for Jesus. And sometimes he tells stories like this where if that's God, he's kind of calling us unworthy servants who don't deserve anything. So I don't want to miss the point. What he's saying is, I don't want you among the 90% who take what they have for granted and feel that they're owed something by life, by their boss, by their family, by their coworkers, by God. Because if you live a life where you're just owed things, you feel like you kind of have an upper hand and a sense of entitlement. Jesus said you cannot earn an upper hand with God or your boss or your coach or your teacher. And the prodigal son made that mistake, remember. The older brother and the younger brother both came to the prodigal father and felt like they deserved or didn't deserve something based on how they lived. And Jesus, through the story, says, you've got it all wrong. It's not about being deserved before God. It's not about entitlement. And that's the biggest issue here to me, is entitlement. I've heard people say over and over, you may or may not agree with this, depending on how old you are. I've heard people say from many different regions of the country that we live right now in the most entitled generation in history. How many would agree with that? We live in one of the most entitled generations in history, where a person might just kind of go about with the assumption, I deserve what I want. Whether I earn it or not, I deserve it. Colleges are starting to build bigger dorm rooms with kind of a suite, but also to have students who just don't know how to share space with a student because they've never had to, because they feel entitled to their own space, have a big dorm room with no roommate and more space. They also are starting to add more ice cream buffets, even though it jacks up tuition and expenses oftentimes, because students feel entitled and they'll go to the college where they can get an ice cream buffet, I heard in an interview. Businesses are starting to train millennials differently. People in their 20s coming out of college, they're starting to train them differently. And they're starting to train rather their managers differently to manage them, because they just think so differently about work and about commitment, about dedication. And some things they bring are incredible to the table that employees haven't brought before, but sometimes we, this next generation, are bringing a sense of entitlement. One story, I talked to a person who manages a large company as the president, and then she has obviously managers under her. She had one employee who wanted to be on Facebook all day long. So she'd do her job and then minimize the window and open up Facebook and message friends. And, at first it was just kind of like, hey, let's not be on Facebook all day. And after a week, it was like, you've been here a week. Get off Facebook. The next week, when it didn't stop, like, it's over. Get off your desk. Get over in this room. We're meeting with the CEO and your manager. This is ridiculous. So they sat down around the table and they walked her through the policy that she signed, no personal things during work hours. And this employee looked back at them and said, well, I just disagree with you. And they all walked out of that meeting, she said, with a real lesson about entitlement. We're going to have to think and negotiate things differently because of the entitlement in our culture. They said they'd never seen anything like that before. You see it in politics, when people demand the government fix a problem, maybe that we are ourselves and community responsible for fixing. I just saw the 60-minute story on Sunday. Did you see this? About a small town in Pennsylvania that was in a hurry to get a Christmas tree, so they hacked one down from near the baseball field, put it up in the town square, and it died right away, like the branches just died. And it looked like a large version of the Charlie Brown anemic Christmas tree, from the Christmas story. And pretty soon, people start kind of protesting and writing letters and making phone calls saying, we deserve a nice tree. And so they started this movement to just raise the money, gather the funds, spend more taxpayer dollars to get another tree. And then someone on the city council said, wait a minute, do we deserve a better tree? Should we spend money on another one? Because you know what, the last I checked, life isn't always perfect, and no citizen in our city is perfect, and sometimes maybe we need to just accept something as okay, good enough, as if maybe we're not entitled to more. I don't know how this works for you, but I want us to think about today. Do you take the good things in your life for granted rather than for things that should draw you back to adoring rather than abandoning Jesus? Do you take them for granted? And do you see the bad things that happen to you as life giving you a raw deal of you not getting what you deserve? And if so, Next time you feel those things, just watch what happens inside of you, the stress, the anger, the negativity, the resentment towards life or God or others that just kind of comes from that feeling. 9 out of 10 lepers felt that life had dealt them a raw deal. 9 out of 10 lepers felt that life had given them a bad hand and they were entitled to more, and when they got it, they moved on. The moment they felt they get healed, they leave Jesus in the rearview mirror saying, I got what I deserve, and I'm moving on. But part of that was because they felt chosen and entitled to more. Don't let your being chosen drive you that direction. Let it drive you back to the chooser, the gift. One leper felt zero entitlement. He felt like he deserved nothing. And so his illness didn't drive him away, and his healing didn't drive him away. His healing was a bonus, and he was so overwhelmed by gratitude that he was drawn back to Jesus. Here's a phrase I want to teach us today, and I just want to have you to hold it in your mind. Repeat after me. God doesn't owe me anything. Say it with me. God doesn't owe me anything. I tell you what, those 5 words can change your life. This week, when you're in that circumstance where you're tempted to take the things you have for granted and to kind of take the road away from God, to see things in your life as getting a raw deal, remind yourself, God doesn't owe me anything. And that means that everything I have, including the things I have left, if I'm dealing with a problem, the things I have left, a heartbeat and brain waves at the very least, is a ridiculous, lavish gift. John 1 describes Jesus as grace upon grace. You are already, if God took everything you have away, covered with grace upon grace upon grace. And when you see life that way, it is so freeing. It is actually freeing to realize that God doesn't owe us anything. That we don't need to earn the upper hand on him. That we don't try to steal the gifts from the giver and hoard them. The challenge to you this week is to be the 1 in 10. We live in a sophisticated, tech-savvy generation where it's kind of cool to pull your phone out and be able to do amazing things around the world and to kind of act like it's no big deal, right? I can check the stock market in Malaysia. Boom, easy. I was at the Detroit airport once, and I was a little low on money to pay for my flight, and so I sold the one investment I had. I was like in college. I had gotten an investment in a mutual fund, and I clicked sell at the airport. I felt like $1 million. We live in a generation that wants to look like that's no big deal. It is a pretty cool thing. So many things we have are just undeserved, amazing gifts. That God doesn't want us to be so nuanced and so sophisticated. So the experiment that you could take this week, if you want to write it down in the back, is when you start to feel that bitterness, I deserve, entitlement spirit come over, whether things are going great or whether things are going the opposite direction, write down, call to mind 5 things that you're grateful for, and repeat it in your head, God doesn't owe me anything. If you're in a group of people and they just want to gossip about someone who's making life miserable, about a government person, about a coach or an authority or a boss or a manager, and they just want to complain, invite them to do this with you. Hey guys, this is fine, but what are 5 things you're thankful for? They'll look at you like you're the enemy, by the way. Because I just want to write what we're thankful for, because God doesn't owe us anything. Everything we have is a gift. It's grace upon grace upon grace upon grace upon grace. You are going to notice that you feel different. You are also going to notice that you are happier. When you feel less entitled, you will be happier. You will also be drawn to the giver of your gifts rather than drawn to hoarding the gifts themselves. You'll be drawn to the giver when you recognize you're not entitled to his gifts. Notice today, November 30th, 2014, we're still talking about a foreigner, Samaritan leper who lived 2,000 years ago. We're still talking about the dude. You're going to be unique if you live without entitlement, and if you live for the giver rather than the gift. You're going to be different, and people are going to notice, and it's going to spread, and they're going to want to be around people like that. As we close in prayer today, I'm going to kind of give us a vision to have in our minds as we pray. So let's stand and close in prayer together as the band comes back up. As we just close our eyes, I want you to imagine standing in a crowd of people like this one, maybe even bigger, maybe thousands and hundreds of thousands, just an endless sea of crowd, except for we're not standing on a nice tile floor, we're standing in quicksand. Your toes now are starting to go down. Now your ankles. We're sinking under the weight of entitlement. The weight of, I deserve everything I have. I deserve better than what I have. And then one person in the middle of that crowd, maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else, in this dark, dank dungeon of sinking people, one person in the crowd shouts at the top of his lungs, God doesn't owe me anything. And instantly that one person brightens up like a Christmas tree and lifts 2 feet above the ground, above everyone else, and they all turn with bewilderment on their faces. And then someone else says it across the crowd about a quarter mile away, and they grow equally bright and lift out of the sinking sand. And then 2 turn to 20, turn to 30 people in a chorus in unison. God doesn't owe me anything. And then finally, after a sea of voices flood, the crowd is filled with light. Everyone joins in. It starts to sound like a song, and we start feeling lighter and happier and more excited and unique. And we start seeing other gifts that we took for granted, and we start thanking for those, and the light gets brighter and the load gets lighter, and it's contagious. God, make us stand out like that. Make us stand out like loud sweaters this Christmas. Kill our sense of entitlement. Make us choose the giver instead of the gift, so that others see and catch it and are never the same. In Jesus' name, all God's people said, amen.